And the majority of us, we graduate in an area and then we end up doing something else.
Visions are often communicated in a very dry way.
You focus more on what you need than what you want.
Inflation, very simply, is it costs you more on average to buy the same goods compared to a previous period.
You look at the neighboring countries and you see all these skyscrapers and you say, oh, they have a very strong economy.
That we will double the standard of living. People say, what do you mean? Is it going to change my income? Is it going to add more money in my pocket?
Do you think the general public understand the vision?
What do you want to be in 20 years from now? Where are you now and how are you going to get there?
Are you in a position to change some of the aspects or the goals in your vision? Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Dear brothers and sisters, welcome to Dome Podcast. And I'm your host, Hatim Al Abdissalaam. And today we have an honorable guest. Our guest is His Highness Al Sayyid Dr. Adham bin Turki Al Sayyid. Assalamu alaikum, Doctor.
Wa alaikum assalam.
How are you today?
Alhamdulillah, doing
Welcome
very
to Dome Podcast.
Thank you very much for having me.
Dr. Adham is an assistant professor of economics at Sultan Qaboos University, and he is also the co-founder of the firm for business and economic consulting. Welcome, Doctor, again to the show.
Thank you.
And today we're going to talk about a very interesting topic, which is economics. I believe that economics is very important to everybody, and for the young people and college students as well, the one you're teaching, economics is a vital part of their lives, and it's important to understand some of the aspects of it. So we're going to start off by talking about the vision. The vision of Oman is 2040, but why is it important for a nation to have a vision? And how is the period of the vision is determined? Some nations, they have 10 years vision, 5 years vision, 30 years vision. How is that determined? And how do we implement the vision?
So Hatim, you've asked a very important question about visions and how we design them and their purpose. But let me go back a little bit to the comment you said about how students perceive economics. And I think most of them would probably disagree with you that it is not vital in any way except for them to complete their degree. However, I do try in many ways to bring them closer to the concepts and why they really matter and how they might affect our lives. Some of these concepts are obviously abstract in many ways, but most of the time, if one is successful, the appreciation of it. What is economics? Economics is a behavioral science, meaning it affects us as individuals, as organizations, as governments, as countries, as the world itself, the globe. And most of what we look at in economics is how do our decisions get made? Why do we choose A versus B? And that's really economics 101. As complex as people think it is, it's really all about decisions, collectively or individually. And this brings us to the discussion about visions. When we think of countries on a timeline, countries generally are thought of as decades rather than simply 1 year after another or 5 years. And to be able to operate any economy, you either do it blindly, as we'd say in Arabic, ala al-baraka,
Yes.
and make decisions on the go.
And maybe that was the past nations, they used to do that. They didn't have a vision. They just go based on what they have.
But they're guiding principles.
Yes.
So if you think of back in the day when you had, say, any type of economy, the ultimate goal was to create as much wealth as possible.
Yes.
Agrarian economies that depend on agriculture and fishing usually meant that you are able to sustain yourself. So much of the effort went into that. Industrial economies ended up having capitalists or some sort of capital owners that invested, created value through that investment, and workers started not to work for themselves but for others. So the guilds blended into factory workers and sort of producers of goods and services, but not necessarily for themselves, for others. So scaling up your cobbler, your baker's job into mass production. And as that progressed, the economics dynamics had to change. The way we think about trade had to change. Trade was always thought of, for example, as a win-lose situation, mercantilism, the sort of the Machiavellian approach. I can only be better off by reducing your wealth and your income because that comes to me.
Yes.
Later on, we've seen that move into the win-win situation and the idea of trade benefits everyone. That's the idea of specialization, Adam Smith. And really, that's where economics today builds a lot of the understanding that we need each other. There is interdependence, and hence globalization was a big thing in the last few decades.
Yes.
Then we realize that some of those benefits may be more one-sided rather than completely equitable. So visions come into this whole story by countries trying to position themselves and societies into how do we benefit from this whole story of production, social development, economic development, and even political development. For a country like Oman, the story of development started in the 70s, at least if we think of the contemporary era. And with the late Sultan Qaboos bin Saeed Tayyib Allah Thara coming into power at the time, there was a necessity to lift Oman from where it was to where it is today. So in 76, Oman endeavored on its first development plans, and many countries at that time were looking at these 5-year development plans.
And that's what we remember from the days of school. We used to hear the 5-year plan.
Absolutely. And these 5-year plans really were the way governments organized themselves into setting agendas and strategies on what is needed. So that's 5-year plans really, in hindsight, look a bit short-sighted today because we're looking at future decades into the future today when we think of things like climate change and the effects of how AI might affect us. But many of these organizations, whether they were in the communist era, whether in the capitalist era, more so in the planned economies, collective economies, the planning where the state was very heavily involved, where there was a lot of development needed, infrastructure development for the betterment of the whole economy. So government led the role, put out these plans on what is going to happen in the next 5 years, how I'm going to spend any income I have, whether it's from selling hydrocarbons or taxation or fees, whatever source of income, and what are the ultimate goals. Development of private sector, for example, by engaging them into these projects, creating job opportunities, developing infrastructure that supports all of these economic activities. In Oman's story, by 1990, early 90s, we realized that is not sufficient anymore.
You mean the 5-year plan?
5-year plans. So they're ongoing, and they acted as your medium-term planning tool, but we needed a bit of a purpose, if you like. Where are we going? So the development of the first vision in Oman, Vision 2020, and ironically at the time, Vision 2020 also applies clarity in the vision. So in 1995, after much deliberation at the technical level and a national symposium at that time, at a much smaller scale compared to today, developed a document that basically looked at how would Oman look like in 2020? What do we want? And that was a key question with visions. Often when we think of businesses, vision is we are going to be this or that. So countries today might choose to be leaders in a specific type of industry, leaders in a specific type of economy, very open, dynamic, talent creating. There are multiple options. There is no unique proposition that all countries must follow through. So back then, Oman was very focused on reducing its dependence on hydrocarbons, creating a dynamic private sector, creating more involvement for nationals in the workforce, which are ultimately the same goals we still seek today. How well we've achieved those goals are not really dependent on what plans did we need to have in place in cycles of 5 years to focus on different elements.
And what tools did we use to implement these goals?
Much of what we've seen in that period, for Oman at least, was the alignment of the 5-year plans to the overall vision. But the challenge was always how to get your accounting mindset into an economic development mindset.
Yes.
It's very easy for governments anywhere in the world to think, how much can I spend and how much revenue do I make that will support that spending? That's the accounting mindset. That's the public finance mindset. The development mindset is based on what kind of outcomes am I going to get? Some of them are intangible and some of them are very tangible. So if I'm going to spend more on education,
And also setting the priorities, right?
the priorities. Yeah. Back then, the priorities were, I wouldn't say simpler, but less complex. So we've achieved some of the targets that we wanted for Vision 2020, like improving the standard of living, which is often measured by average income overall in the economy. And we'll talk more about that a bit later. But that improvement meant that our spending capability, our purchasing power in the local economy has improved. But what we've noticed at that period, much of that was driven by government employment. That meant that although we improved standard of living, it was highly connected to government spending, government jobs, and later on to how much revenue can the government generate. So that model was not sustainable. So in the 2000s, once we got closer to 2020, it was necessary not only just to evaluate the progress, which I must say in some areas it was good, in some areas it was lacking. It was a bit of a challenge. We had a few crises along the way in the 90s.
Those are also global crises.
Global crises. But what global crises do to your visions is give them a good shake-up, where your objectives will have to be realigned and readjusted. Those mechanisms were not in place. The engagement. So that brought us up to the early 2000s, and I'd say in the teen years, where it was necessary to revisit our vision again.
Dr. Adham, sorry, I will interrupt you. In terms of the goals that you set in the vision, sometimes changes happen because you took us through the gradual change in the economy, from agriculture to industrial and so on. And are you in a position to change some of the aspects or the goals in your vision based on the global changes, or is it fixed? Now, for example, now we have the 2040 vision, and we already have the elements.
Absolutely.
Yeah, but things do change. Maybe the priorities, the economy, the global economy is going to change. So are we in a position to change or to adjust the vision?
Absolutely. I think one of the critical things is visions are subject to change. And if they're not, then you've got a rigid vision that does not suit the times. If we've been planning visions in our part of the world for at least 2 decades ahead, which means we're looking 20 years into the future.
Yes.
And, you do this strategy kind of approach. What do you want to be in 20 years from now? Where are you now? And how are you going to get there? So in Oman's experience in visioning for 2040, it started in about 2016 or so, or 15 or before, where I was fortunate to be engaged earlier on with a group of people into how would we vision before talking about the vision. And one should be mindful that visions are really high level. We should be careful not to set too many targets and visions, because those will quickly go wayward, because, as you've correctly pointed out, changes are going to happen. So in the process of the visioning, which involved thousands of Omanis and residents in Oman, youth, elderly, middle-aged, young people, into what do we want? That was the first question. So, everyone had a lot of perspectives and a lot of demands of what this vision should be. But ultimately, for Oman, that boiled down to 12 national priorities. And this is where I come back to the point you've mentioned about priorities. So if you're going to have a vision for your country, whatever that vision is, Oman is going to be amongst the advanced economies in the world. And that's the slogan that we have. What does it mean to be amongst? Do you want to be number one?
That's a broad statement.
Exactly. So the 12 priorities came to anchor those expectations. What do we want for our governance? As a government, as a service provider, as a planner, as a social protector, if you like, all of these elements meant that there were some elements required of the institutions. So governance became very important. What do we want for our environment? Sustainability became an important element. What do we want for our private sector? further participation. Obviously, there were numbers put out there, but I'm wary of numbers because change means those numbers will have to adjust, and they will adjust.
Yes.
What do we want for our labor market? What do we want for our education, our health? So those 12 priorities, which are national consensus, and it isn't simply because a decision maker decided, or an academic, or a technical person, or an economist, or a social scientist decided this is how it should be. There are strategic directions, which means what? That this is what we want. We've got 4 pillars in Oman: institutions, the environment, people and society, and the economy.
Yes.
The economy gets the lion's share of these priorities because it's interacting with all of the other ones. So from the 12, there's about 60% of them involved in labor market, foreign direct investment, trade, all of these aspects. Why are they critical? Because under them, there are a number of strategic goals, and these are open-ended in some ways. We're going to better manage our environment. Our use of natural resources is going to be more balanced. These need to be open-ended because from when we've set the vision and launched it, His Majesty's in 2020 approved the launch of the vision itself and the adoption of it, we needed to have direction. Is Oman going to continue using hydrocarbons for energy, for example? Within the vision, there were targets set for about 40% of our energy in Oman will be produced from renewables. By when? 2040, inshallah.
Inshallah.
How are we going to do that? Are we going to use solar? Are we going to use wind? Are we going to use green
you
hydrogen?
have to have an alternative.
What comes after are policies that support those national priorities and strategic direction. If the change today, as it is today, the tilt towards green hydrogen as a source of energy in the next 20 years, that's what Oman is positioning itself. Let's say 10 years down the road, green hydrogen is viable, but there are other new technologies that Oman can. That flexibility
Is there.
And that gets applied in those 5-year plans. So what we've seen in the 5-year plans today is the 10th plan is focusing on the pillars of the vision itself and mapping many of the programs, many of the projects, not just physically building things, projects to improve education in the science and math, for example, projects to improve access to universal health, financial inclusion. These are all called projects, but they're not physical projects. They're projects to access electronic payments. All feed back into the ultimate goal. A society that is creative, a society that is innovative, a society that is able to generate more knowledge, be a knowledge-based economy, etc. So the visions are really what you want to do. You set yourself a goal, but a very long-term goal. But the path to it isn't a straight line. We find for many countries, including Oman, you have to navigate those changes, the ups and downs. A pandemic threw a wrench into the whole works.
Nobody expected it.
Nobody expected. But what it taught us is, how do we manage such crises? Do we have the systems? Do we have the social safety nets? Do we have the right support? Are we able to manage it? Not just as governments, as individuals? Are we able to leverage on the lessons learned? Visions don't give you those answers. The visions remind you that once you've tripped and got up again, hang on, that is still the right direction we're headed to. But now we need to think differently about it.
Now, Dr. Adham, do you think the general public understand the vision? Or they can comprehend with what is going on?
I think one of the things that all of us as citizens is we're a bit detached from the general sort of government dialogue because we tend to be consumed in our own lives.
Yes.
We're very concerned with waking up, going to our universities, schools and jobs.
Earning a living.
Spending. All of those things that naturally every citizen in any country is focused on that sort of what you might describe as a very small locus circle of friends or families, and that's your life. So when governments talk about visions, this tends to be a very abstract thing. When I tell you that we will double the standard of living, people say, what do you mean? Is it going to change my income? Is it going to add more money in my pocket? Am I going to have a bigger house? Are my children going to be in a better school?
What does it mean?
Exactly. So standard of living is one of the trickiest things that people use. And in Arabic, we say al-rafah al-ma'ishi. The word rafah in Arabic, and probably you know this better than I do, the context means luxury.
Yes.
But when we talk about welfare and well-being, we're talking about standard of livings on how well you live. That means there is no lack of opportunity, there is no lack of choice, there is no lack of ability to act on your decisions freely within the law.
Meaning, some of the things will be tangible and some of the things will be intangible.
One of the interesting things I like about when you talk about development and development economics is a saying that defining it, people define it by, having highways and cars and high rises and whatever it is, and you say, hang on, that's economic development. But the most basic definition that I like is the ability to act on opportunities, the ability to make those choices unhindered in such a way that you can better your own. So no one is doing it for you, but your ability to do so. So if we compare countries across the world and we think about this economic development idea, in some countries, you're unable to start up your own business. Not because it's impossible, but you don't have the resources or the ability to get to the right process, if you like.
Yes.
There is no internet access, which means you're unable to communicate with potentially would-be customers. There is no telephone. There is no payments available to you. There's no education.
The infrastructure to facilitate you starting
exactly. And the infrastructure is not just a tangible, as you've pointed out, the intangible one that is, but the fact that you're able to makes a whole lot of difference. Then when you say, yes, we have high rises, but I can't live in them because they're either too expensive, they're not designed suitably for my standard of living, or they're empty. They look nice, they're glittery and whatnot.
And this is the mistake we fall into. Sometimes you look at the neighboring countries and you see all these skyscrapers and you say, oh, they have a very strong economy based on what you see.
And this is one of the tricks that often, driving down here, I see a lot of these apartment buildings.
Yes.
And I see, wow, these haven't been here before. Because every time you come to one area and you see more high-rises or apartment buildings, the assumption is there's more happening. Behind the scenes, there could be a lot of debt driving that building, and that debt perhaps is not always paid back.
And honestly, when you come in the evening, it's total darkness.
Exactly.
They're empty.
Interesting that you said darkness. One of the indicators of economic development is how much electricity is being used and visible at night. And a lot of satellite images show you these night sort of areas.
Images.
Exactly. If you compare any country over time, you see the area, lit up area, grow over time. This is not necessarily the case in every country just because you have more. If no one is living in those areas, no one is using those roads, and no electricity will be wasted in that area, so you'll find a lot of it is shut down. Interestingly, it's not an economic indicator in the sense of numbers. It's just simply a visual indicator. But we mix up a lot of what we see and what we assume. You go to a mall and you see a lot of people walking in the mall, you think, oh, hang on, we're okay. What are you talking about? Bad economic times.
Most of them are window shopping.
Exactly. And you see this in every country around, where people are very careful how much they spend and how much. Now, going back to that question of, are we aware of visions? For all those reasons of what we see around us and assume that there's good things happening or bad things happening, we don't really see the big picture, because visions are often communicated in a very dry way. We often say, we will do this, and we're very rosy about how we do it, which is nice. But what we've tried to do here in Oman is not only put out the vision, which a lot of people were involved with, but those who were not directly involved with it often receive it either as a document that is to them too long to read, or the language isn't preferably, I wouldn't say readable, but
user-friendly.
Yeah, it is absolutely. The production of the document itself is very easy to read. I use it for my students, and when I force them to read it, and then I tell them, listen, you guys have to read this because I'm going to ask you about it. And I find they never complain about the readability because it's both in Arabic and English, but also the way it's set out, even the process. The problem is how we use that tool to say, for example, here in your channel, you're saying, I've created the channel. I'm doing all of this because of the vision.
Yes.
But I say, Hatim, where do you fit into this big picture? I say, no, I don't know. I'm just doing my job. I'm educating people. I'm engaging people. I'm like, no, Hatim, where are you fitted in this whole big picture? We've done a bit of work, not the academic, but on a consulting side, with organizations that look to align themselves to the vision. And we ask a very simple question. Are you aware of it? Some will say yes, some will say no. So we go down to, where is this? Where did it come from? Why is it important for you? I was like, yeah, I'm a TV channel, I'm a podcast channel, I'm an internet channel. This has nothing to do with me. I was like, no, you're part of it. When we talk about the identity element of Oman Vision 2040, one of the key elements for society is individuals or citizens who are proud of their identity. It's like, yeah, we're all proud. We're wearing our clothing, we're wearing our... How is this economic visioning? And part of your belongingness or belonging to a nation is the ability to be productive and add value to that nation. Whether you do it in culture, whether you do it in business, whether you do it in anything, you're being an active member. If you don't sense that belonging, if you don't have that sense of belonging, you are less likely to work, less likely to save, less likely to spend, because you're constantly feeling the fear of, this is not home, I'm not settled, I'm not part of all of this.
And you don't feel that you're contributing to the vision itself.
So this is a very small element of the big picture. If you're going to have a sense of belonging, and we're able to instill that, how do we instill sense of belonging? Do we chant rhetorics? Do we get people involved? People engaged? All of that means that someone has to do this. If it's not going to be the government, it's going to be us as individuals.
Yes.
And each one of us is going to take it upon himself or herself to do so. As individuals, it's easy to say, listen, I relate to the vision by doing 1, 2, 3. But as organizations, you need to take a more structured role. That's where you need to understand, if I'm an institution in education, I need to decide which part am I going to... I can't fit the whole bill. I'm going to help create more innovation through research. Fair enough. How are you going to fund that research? Government funding? Through
Private sector?
Exactly. I'm going to engage with industry to solve solutions. I'm going to align myself with other partners who are going to help me get to that level, international and local. Once you get that, that's when you start to become relevant. The vision becomes relevant to you, and you start to add value. As individuals, we're a bit more removed from all that picture. But if I'm not aware of it, if I am not in my generation and the next generation, the one after, feel connected to it, the sense of purpose is lost to all of us. Many people believe that governments are the only ones who lead the visions. The leadership is there. But when the government says, I want to change all of my services into electronically delivered services,
it impacts everybody.
Exactly. But as society, if we do not accept that, how do we reach those ultimate goals of better service provision, better transparency, reduction in corruption, all of the things that we society want? But listen, I don't want to use e-payments, I want to pay cash. طيب, there's a small business that is very wary of using cash because it might get lost, misplaced, or whatever. It rather does all of its systems electronically, easier to pay. Or the small business is a bit wary of using all of these technologies and really likes the cash business, cash on delivery, and it's a cash-based. It's much easier, there's less of a headache. How are we going to move these smaller businesses or mid-sized businesses into better performing, better service providers, whatever they do, if they do not accept going on to this journey?
Yes.
So I think for individuals, the relevance will always be, how do I conduct my life around these services? And how do I take advantage of what is available in less of a hassle, if you like, going back to that definition of improving my ability to achieve all of the things I want to, because this whole system now is better than what it used to be prior, 5, 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago, as part of this journey towards the bigger vision.
Dr. Adham, if you allow me, we're going to take a short break and then come back and discuss more topics about economics. Dear brothers and sisters, welcome back to Dome Podcast, and my honorable guest is His Highness Sayyid Dr. Adham Al Sayyid. Welcome back, Doctor.
Thank you, Hatim. Thank you.
Now, Doctor, how do we understand economics in general?
Now, moving away from theories, because
Yes.
no one likes theories, we often, when we want to understand any economy, we look at numbers. And today, we have so many ways of thinking about those numbers and how they affect us. But often, more than none, when you read the newspapers and when you look at any sort of trade journals, economists generally look at very high-level indicators to start with.
Yes.
So we think of the gross domestic product, which is the output produced in economy. We think of inflation as the cost of living. And we think of unemployment, sort of the fraction of people who are able to work and want to work but cannot find jobs.
Yes.
And then the other elements that we also focus on is public finance, government revenues, government spending, and the gap between those two. So we talk about things like deficits, government debts, and how that might be met. And finally, we look at the external factors. We look at trade, exports and imports. We look at exchange rates and the balance of payments, which divides itself into trade balance, the difference between importing and exporting, and the current account. Now, the first three are what we often think of as the vital signs. When I describe these, I tell people, when la qaddallah you go to the doctor,
Yes.
they often take you to triage just before you kind of go in, and they check your temperature, they check your weight, they check your height, they check your blood pressure. These are initial indicators of whether you are unwell, at least visibly, and they're able to get a feel for where you are, health-wise. If you're a bit overweight for your height, your age is so and so. But those are never enough. Doctors will always move on to the next thing.
Have more investigations.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Physicals,
Diagnose.
pathologies, and whatnot. But if you were to diagnose economies based on the three indicators, very clearly, you just don't look at them at one point in time. You have to look at them over time and see whether this gross domestic product, the output, how much was produced in your general geographical borders. You produced, in the simplest forms, 3 apples, 2 computers, and 3 visits to the dentist.
Yes.
There's a service, there's an output, and there's, the output is food and then technology. If that keeps increasing over time, that's a positive sign. But does it increase because it costs more, or does it increase because you're just simply producing? Because we're using Omani Riyals, dollars, or euros numbers, which
Yes.
makes it much easier. The best example to think of this is whenever you go to grocery shopping and you pick up that very long receipt, total
Yes.
waste of paper, but you read through it and you find all of the items listed, their price, quantity, all of that adds up to a single number. So did you spend more on your grocery this month, Hatim? There's no way for you to know. You might have bought 2 bananas.
There is no
and then
comparison.
No comparison.
Yeah.
But when you look at those receipts, you look at the numbers and say, hang on, I just spent another 10 riyals more than last month.
Yes.
But that 10 riyals, did it buy you more or buy you the same quantity? Really depends on whether it cost you more to buy those groceries or not.
So the value of the product has increased.
Exactly. So often many people will read the newspaper and say, the output of our country increased by 30% from, say, a year ago. 30% is a huge output. Think of it this way. Last year, you produced what's worth 10 riyals. This year, you produced something worth about 13 riyals. That 13 riyals, when you look at it in a country, that's in billions. Oman's output today is about 30 billion plus Omani riyals. In dollars, if you multiply it by 2.5, that's about 75 to 80 billion dollars. If you compare this to a decade ago, it's by far much larger. If you compare it to 5 decades ago, It's many, many times over. This means that over time, Oman's capability to produce more things has increased, which is a positive sign. But economists don't stop there. They go back and say, what was it last year, the year before, and the year before? And we will notice that it's been going up and down. So economies go through cycles. And these cycles mean that at certain times you're producing more, at certain times you're producing less. At certain times you're producing the same, roughly the same amount, but there's a price hike, such as we've seen in 2022 in oil prices.
Yes.
So Oman's economy is roughly divided about 35 to 40% oil and gas, and the rest is services, public services, wholesale, retail, tourism, etc. All of these things put together, education and health and whatnot. So when the 40% value, just in dollars, goes up with the same production of, say, about 1 million barrels per day, goes up, say, from $60 to $70, Oman's economy suddenly, in numbers, increases. And we're quite pleasantly happy about that. The problem is when you go back and look at it, we say, did we produce more?
No, the same quantity.
The same quantity.
The same quantity.
And hence we're careful that sometimes inflated prices can be a bit tricky and send the wrong signal. So economists will often use the word real output. It means physical outputs. So you're like, how many fingers do I have in my hand? Like, there are 4 fingers.
Yeah.
And I was like, all right, now if I add the thumb to it, now I have 5 fingers. That's a real change in numbers, physical change. طبعا, as you've pointed correctly, 2 baskets from year 1 to year 2 are going to be very different. So when we hear in the news 30% increase in our output, we should ask, where did this change come from? If it's in prices, at least from the economic perspective, that worries us because it means there's no more activity than there was before. It's just that it costs more now for whomever is buying that output.
So it means there's no development, there's no like increase in
improvement
production.
Or growth. I would rather than say development, I'll use the word growth. But lillahi alhamd, what we've seen in Oman, in the last couple of years especially, is that there has been modest growth. It's about 1 to 2% or a little bit more in non-oil activities, which is the better gauge for our type of economy. But in any economy, when you look at change, you want to see, did we produce more apples and computers and dentist services, among many other things, or are they the same? طيب, if the case is for an economy that there's no change in physical output but a higher price, we shift to the other indicator, which is inflation.
Yes.
طيب, inflation, people think, yeah, I went out today, and I'll use a very rudimentary example, and bought myself some tomatoes, and they cost twice as much as they did last month. There must be inflation. The cost of living has gone up. Economists will say, wait a minute, did all of the other items you buy increase in price? It's like, no, it was just the tomatoes. طيب, economists will classify that as tomatoes prices have gone up. So, no, it cost me more to buy, my groceries are more. It's like, yeah, but tomatoes are perhaps a fraction of your food budget. In fact, I don't think many people buy them on a regular basis or whatever it is.
Depending on the need.
Exactly. So you could switch from tomatoes if they're too expensive and still maintain your budget. So when we think of inflation, we think of it as a basket of products that you as an individual or business even buy. And then how does this basket change over time? Now, this basket is not simply tomatoes and coffee and tea and whatever it is. It's everything that you buy. So Hatim goes every month and spends 10 riyals. 2 riyals are going to be spent on, or 2.5 on food, another 2.5 on transportation, 1 riyal on entertainment, another 500 basis on health, and another 250 basis on education. These all become little fractions of the bigger 10 riyals that you've spent. طيب, you buy the same thing every month and you spend the same amount of phone calls, internet, everything, services and goods, but now you pay 11 riyals next month.
Yes.
So on average, you're paying more for the same basket. Someone say, hang on, what's going on? It's costing me more to buy things. So in very simple terms, inflation doesn't look at just the 11 riyals. It looks at the percentage increase from the 10 riyals to the 11 riyals and says, your basket has just gone up by 10%. Someone will say, wow, 10%, that's a lot of increase, right? If it's 100 riyals, if it's 1,000 riyals, 10% goes up. طيب, do we have inflation now? The answer is yes. How is it different from the tomato example? Inflation, very simply, is it costs you more on average to buy the same goods compared to a previous period. Last month, last year. What we've seen around the world in the last few years is that the price of food, the price of essentials has gone up significantly for two main reasons.
Is it because of the demand and the supply?
Perfect. One of the things that drives prices is wanting to buy more of the same products and there's limited quantity.
Yes.
This is what we often describe as demand-driven or demand-push inflation. We as consumers are the cause. Think of real estate. Real estate is always limited. It takes time to build more stuff. So if everyone wants to live in a specific area and they have the resources and the means to buy,
so the prices shoot up.
Will shoot up. Why? Is someone being greedy? Is someone trying to charge more? If we have a market that's very open, you can charge 20% over the price what should be, and everyone will say, no, we're not buying from you.
So they normally there's no cap for people just...
Yeah, but someone will say, example of NFTs.
Yes.
When they first started, the numbers were crazy. We're talking tens of thousands, if not more. Then people realized very quickly, hang on, there's too few of these. They started producing more of theirs. The markets will adjust, as long as nothing is stopping them. But when the capacity to make more, or make more available, build more, or provide more of a service or a good, but there's still more demand on that because there's more income in our pockets, we're able to buy more, suddenly we'll find that the prices will pick up to meet that demand. So less people will be able to buy compared to before at a higher price. Often people think of this as merchants being greedy and whatnot, but the merchants have limited supply in their storage. Naturally, to meet that extra demand, to produce more, they have to pay more wages, they have to pay more electricity, they have to pay more fuel. All of these costs mean the price will eventually. Now here we're assuming, and the word assuming is always problematic, that this is a free market, there's no control over the product or service, and everyone who sees an opportunity can enter the market. Example is the shale gas industry in the US.
Yes.
To set up the setup, you need money, but the setup is much easier to create a rig for shale gas compared to a rig for proper gas that we have in our part of the world. Not that they didn't get hurt, but you could see the numbers changing by the hundreds, if not thousands, when the prices shot up to the $100 for oil, because the opportunity was there.
Yes.
So that's one side of the story. The other side of the story is when we've had supply chain effects where shutdowns and lockdowns in 2020 and part of 21, and even up to more recently in China, the challenge was before reopening was that many factories might be shut down suddenly because of the zero COVID policy. Now that they've abandoned it, we hope that that would reduce the pressure on the supply chains. But many businesses went out and they lost in Oman, in the rest of the world. That meant that your provider of, say, the coffee for your cup of coffee or tea is suddenly out of business. I need to find a new supplier. That new supplier is engaged with other retailers and wholesalers. They cannot provide you today. So your business today has a problem. How do I make use of the existing coffee that I have? The price has to go up. Otherwise, I cannot get any more coffee later on. So the supply side story means that there is less available and the price eventually goes up because the demand is there, it's not being met. There's not enough there. So inflation happens on both sides. We as consumers just sense the final price. So how do we deal with that? We just have to fork out more money or make decisions on what to delay or defer in our payments for these products. You might think, hang on, I'm paying too much money for entertainment. I'm going to cancel some of my subscriptions.
So you're prioritizing
Exactly.
your spending. So you focus more on what you need than what you want.
Now, here's the biggest challenge. I've just made a huge assumption that A, you will make those substitutions, and B, some of your spending is, let's call it ancillary or subject to those changes. But where it hits hard, if 60% of your budget, 70% of your budget goes to housing and food, and the other goes to your kids' education, where the margins are so small that a 1 riyal difference could break the budget. A 5 riyal here, or it's not the luxury of getting your coffee from a gourmet coffee place, or, necessarily that you are paying extremely high fees for a very luxurious education for your kids. The word luxurious doesn't work very well with education, mind you. But, you're
a better education service.
Exactly. Sometimes better, sometimes, that in itself is a different story. But many people don't have that luxury. And their budgets are living on the edge. They've got commitments, they've got loans, and they've got, all of those challenges. So inflation can be very problematic. That's why, for example, in Oman, the government tries to reduce the impact by using subsidies on fuels. They were meant to be removed.
Electricity and the bills in general.
Many, and you still find those in our bills. You see what percentage is being covered. The food items, the staples, are being supported. So the wholesalers are being paid to compensate them for the international prices.
Yes.
Because they have to pay those. There's no option. If you're going to bring rice and rice is more expensive, someone has to pay the difference to bring the price down in the local market.
Yeah.
So it becomes a huge challenge. In 2022, we paid more than 1 billion riyals collectively for all of that support. 1 billion riyals out of a budget of about 12 billion riyals. That's about 8 to 9%.
It's a lot.
It's a lot of money. A lot of money that's not producing anything. It's just gauging us. But alhamdulillah, we've been fortunate that we're able to do this. Otherwise, we'd have seen the prices increase much higher than what they have. They've increased about 3 to 4% over the last couple of years.
Yeah.
Again, not all prices. It's not the price of coffee. No one cares about, product X, fancy coffee going up by another 200 basis. It is, I'll go back to the tomatoes. If the tomatoes was a staple,
yes,
and it goes up by 200-300 basis per kilo,
it will affect you.
It will affect you. If your children's education goes up by another 100 riyals,
it will affect you.
And you have 6 children, that's 600
It's
riyals.
a necessity.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's where the inflation is. This kind of seeps into the story of unemployment. So we have output changing up or down. We're producing more or less. Prices affecting not only consumers but producers, because when producers have to pay more, they pass on the prices. The protection measure that we have here is consumer protection does not allow you to change your prices immediately. It has to be approved. So businesses have to absorb some of those costs.
Yeah.
Some businesses to some extent can, but when you run your own business, you cannot keep absorbing these extra costs. Some of the extra costs come from wages. When you're mandated to pay a minimum wage, which in Oman is around 325 riyals per month.
Well, maybe the income that is coming to the company is not sufficient enough to cover the wages.
Some may deem 325 not sufficient.
Yes.
Which arguably it isn't. But as a 23-year-old graduate from university with zero experience, you find it challenging to find a job easily because of the experience lack of. If you're a school dropout for whatever reason, if you're a university dropout for whatever reason, where can you find employment at that stage? It's extremely difficult because you're deemed either unqualified,
or
incapable,
unskilled.
or unskilled. So minimum wage was meant to have an introduction. It's not for someone who has experience. It shouldn't be for a first-time entrant into the job market with some qualifications, some basic skills. I would often say it is the job that determines the wage and not your qualification that determines the wage.
Yes.
But experience and skill is an add-on. It's a bonus that you would carry forward and raise those wages. But anyhow, so for businesses, the more I mandate of them to pay higher wages, direct laws or indirect kind of pressure, this means that their costs go up. Now, if this business cannot sustain that, what happens to the people working in that business? They may lose their jobs, la qadar Allah.
And that's what we have seen during
Exactly.
COVID as well.
Right? And we're talking about people who are working and suddenly become unemployed. طيب, when we measure these numbers, we look at the head count. How many people are working today? Public, private sector. How many people from those, added on to those people who form what we call the labor force, who are wanting to work but cannot find a job? Maybe they had a job, or maybe they're a first-time entrant and they're willing and able to seriously find a job. So the economic definition tends to be a bit removed from the social sensitivities. It's very black and white. Hatim, are you looking for a job? You say, no, I'm employed. I'm self-employed. I work for myself, or I work for someone.
Yes.
So Hatim, check, he's employed. Adham, are you working? I was like, no. Are you seriously looking for a job? I'm not interested at the moment. I'm studying. I'm writing a book and I don't want anyone to bother me.
Yes.
Adham is out of the
equation.
He's not even in the labor force because he is not looking for a job.
And he's not interested.
And he's not working. So he's doing his own thing. Now, there's a third person. He or she wants to work, is capable of working, but cannot find the opportunity, whatever that opportunity is. He or she will become unemployed. So the statistics will include it. So amongst the three of us, I'm out of the labor force, part of the bigger population, those retired, those who don't want to work, those who cannot work by law, under 15s or under 16s.
Yes.
Homemakers, men or women who stay at home and care for someone else, for example. All of those. But the labor force is made up of Hatim and this other person. Now, when we come up with a statistic, the labor force is made up of two people. One of them is working and one of them is not working.
Yes.
So the unemployment rate, as we calculated, would be 50%. Because half of the labor force is not working. But remember, how many people are in the labor force? Two people. So the statistics can be a bit tricky when you don't understand them.
So you said it's not linked to the social aspect of...
The social aspect. Let's say I want to work, but I'm not looking for a job.
Yes.
Officially, we call you a job seeker in Oman. Now, when you record that person as a job seeker, suddenly there's a social expectation that you will find me a job somewhere. There has to be. Now, when the statistics come out, if you're not seriously looking for a job, if you're not registered, if you're not actively updating, if you haven't been to an interview, we exclude you from that rate of unemployment.
Yes.
But someone say, no, but I want to work. But the question is, and I'll use this word very carefully here, because are you serious? Because everyone wants to get some income. But how do we go about it? Do I wait at home for the job to come to me? Or do I go and seek the job? Hence the word job seeker. And this becomes a challenge, because there are some people who have been looking for a job for, say, 2-3 years, and they're unable to find a job, and they suddenly stop looking. They will drop out of the statistic. But
so that's why they are asked from time to time to update.
Exactly. That's why we call it
update in the system, that they are still looking for a
so
job.
So the ministry will say, أنت باحث عن عمل نشط, active. The word is active. طبعا in this day and age, it's a bit complex, because when I say a bit different from the social expectation, because say I've registered in the system, why aren't I receiving invites to interviews? Notice how you're waiting for the opportunity to come to you. While others would say, listen, I've been to 3-4 interviews, I haven't been successful. I've got a second interview with this and I'm still having a challenge. I'm qualified in geology, but there are no jobs out there.
Yeah.
This is where the complications become. The expectations of a job seeker. Remember I said right at the beginning, economics is about choices.
Yes.
And how we choose to engage in the labor market is a personal choice. No one can force me to do something I don't want. It's part of being in a society that gives you opportunity. You're responsible for making those opportunities. What are your opportunities today? If there's a job that is not in your qualification and you can apply to, you can apply to it. Nothing stops you from doing so. The business on the other side might see you favorably or unfavorably, because they think, hang on, this person doesn't fit the bill.
Yeah, his field, his area is geologist, and I want an economist. So
exactly, which is a fundamental problem with our labor market. There's a lot of compartmentalization. Adham is an economist. He cannot do anything else. So I tell my students, no one has stamped something on your forehead that says you are 1, 2, or 3 and you cannot do anything else.
And the majority of us, we graduate in an area and then we end up doing something else.
Exactly. But you say the majority.
For example, I am a graduate of accounting and finance, and I'm in media now, which has nothing to do with...
Which is a prime example of our capacity to do things, to be creative, to be productive. But society does not see it that way. There's been a recent appointment in an official position, and I think you know who I'm talking about.
Yeah. And there was a lot of controversial about that.
Exactly. And one of the things that people, positively said is, you need new blood, you need a new way of thinking, and executive positions may not necessarily need expert matter. So do you need an economist to always make economic policy, or do you need an economist and others? So you bring in sensibilities, but others will help make those decisions in such a way. So in media, I'm sure you need professionals who do sound, edit.
Absolutely. There's a lot going behind the scenes.
Exactly.
We're just doing the easy part.
Right. I've moderated many sessions. We were talking before this, right, about panel discussions. But I'm not a subject matter in those issues. But being able to find a way to comfortably moderate and ask the right questions and learn has, lillahi alhamd, has helped me be better at that. I can't say I'm perfect at it, but it's like, what does an economist do in moderating sessions about the environment? I was like, well, I'm aware of the big issue. I'm able to use that knowledge to ask, perhaps sometimes I like to say, naive questions.
Yes.
So what stops a physics graduate from doing sales or doing any type of service? It might find demeaning to say, listen, I'm a graduate and, I can't do this. I was like, hang on. You couldn't have just studied physics for 4 or 5 years. There were other things that you would have done. You might have led your physics society. You might have been in the student council at that stage. You might have engaged in other activities, creative activities. Those skills cannot just fall off. I did a small exercise with some of my students on this very issue, and I asked them, and these were senior students, I said, listen, I want you to do a very simple exercise. Take a piece of paper, white sheet, write your name, date of birth, and then list all of the things that you've done up to this point that make you employable. And
how did that go?
I never saw any papers, unfortunately. But the interesting part was there were a lot of soul-searching looks around. It's like, because we all know the answer to that. When we were in their place, we had nothing to add to that piece of paper. Unless you've been very active from very young, many of them haven't tried a single job, myself included. Until I've done my internship, I wasn't exposed to any job that I had to be there on time. There's expectation, whether it's a paid job or unpaid job. But, it's the way you're raised, the opportunities you want to take. I had a student who was doing part-time work and studying. So I very quickly said, hang on, how are you doing this? I was like, I've got it sorted. I've got my schedule sorted. It was a family business he was working in, a sort of a small family business. But I was like, that's inspiring to me that people are doing that. So can this be translated for the rest of the community? I would say no. It's a personal drive.
Yeah.
Our expectations are set very high for job seekers, that they should be able to start their own businesses. They should be able to do that. But the issue of unemployment, there's always the data, reality, and between them, the gap is expectations of not only job seekers, but businesses, employers, and policymakers that expect that sometimes certain policies will necessarily yield. We forget that we're human beings.
Yes.
And our expectations affect our decisions. So let me move on to the other part of how we look at the economy, which is public finance, something that we hear a lot about.
Yes.
But few of us, I wouldn't say comprehend, appreciate enough.
Maybe this is going to be the last part of our interview, inshallah, Dr. Adham. The public finance is a very important aspect, and so many of us are wondering about it. So if you could tell us a little bit about it.
Sure.
And then inshallah we will come to the end of the show.
So public finance quite simply means how does the government manage its revenues and expenditures. So when we talked about the visions and the 5-year plans,
yes,
right, one of the executive tools, if you like, is the annual budgets. Annual budgets are very simply, the government has just released one on the 1st of January of every year, where the government says, I'm going to spend this much money for the purposes of providing the basic services, and on top of that, there are certain projects that I wish to execute this year, and this is all part of the 5-year plan. And this is the same as you do on an individual budget. If you budget for a company saying next year we're going to spend this on marketing, on development.
Yeah, most of the companies, they have this.
Exactly. So budgets are just basically saying, I expect this much money to come in, and this is how I'm going to spend it. Yeah. Whether you get that much money or not, that's subject to your revenues.
Yes.
Which for us in Oman, primarily 70% of them come from the sale of oil and gas. Another 30% come from government service fees and taxes in Oman, which are limited to 2 main taxes.
Yes.
One is the corporate tax, which is at 15% from your profits.
Yes.
All businesses, except small businesses registered with the Authority for SME Development, card holders.
They're exempted, right?
Yeah, they pay about 3% if they make any profit.
Yeah.
And then there is the value-added tax, which is a consumption-based tax.
The 5%.
Exactly. Which means 5% on all the products you wish to buy.
Yes.
It's very important to put the word wish to buy, because you can choose to change the type of product you buy. Cheaper products would mean less. Or you could choose to not buy them at all, if that is the case. And then there are certain products that are exempt from that. So government makes roughly, I think the estimates for this year, I think between 10 to 11 billion Omani riyals from those sources. Those are estimates. When the government spends that money, it may realize mid-year that it does not have enough revenue. So the government has been very active, the Ministry of Finance, in producing monthly reports, how much revenue came in, where did it come from, and generally how it's spent. Yes. At the end of every year, I think we'll see it in the next 3 months or maybe 2 months, a closing account for what was spent last year.
Like a report.
Exactly. Every business will do this in closing. Governments also do this. So we'll know where we've spent more, where we've spent less compared to what we planned to. So before 2022, oil prices obviously since 2014 have dropped sharply.
Yes.
So the government revenues have fallen to about 8 billion riyals compared to our spending at the time was about 14 billion.
So there's a deficit.
There was a huge gap. And the deficit means that your revenues are
less than...
So given the numbers, I don't have the numbers right now, but any difference between how much you need to spend, not choose to spend, need to spend, because when your revenues collapse, then the only way you can do it is cut back on all of the extra and be on the bare minimum, which is paying salaries and critical services. So that deficit meant that you don't have the money to cover those expenditures. So what do? If you have any reserves, you draw down on those reserves. And then if you can borrow domestically, you would put out what we call bonds. And bonds are a promise to pay back. But with interest, or if they're sukuk, then you pay ribh.
So this is, you get the financing from
the public or the institutions.
Or other institutions.
Exactly.
Even international institutions.
Or you go out and borrow from banks, international banks.
Yes.
Or offer the same bonds, but internationally in dollars.
Okay.
So the obligation there is that you have to pay that percentage that you promised to pay every year, and that's services, or the coupon rate as we call it. Say if it's 5% or 6%, you borrowed 100 riyals. Every year you pay 6 riyals until the date where you have to pay back the original 100.
Okay.
So that's a commitment. So the more you borrow, your debt goes up.
And the interest goes up.
And the service of that obviously will go up. We reached to a point where we were paying almost more than 1 billion riyals. I think it was 2021, if I'm not mistaken, or this year. Almost 1 billion riyals in repayment and the service. The service is not repaying the principal payment. It's just the interest or the ribh, depending, because Oman has 2 tools available to it.
Yes.
Some sukuk and some bonds. And these range from 5 years, some of them to 30 years. So public debt means that whatever government revenue comes, some of it has to be allocated to that. The problem with that is that is unproductive use of the money. It has to be paid, but it cannot go towards health, education, infrastructure, or any
development, research.
Yeah, and that's the problem with debt. Just like your income, when you're paying your car loan or your home loan, you have to repay that. So that
is not generating
anything.
more money.
You're not enjoying anything. You're just wearing down that asset that you're using. And this is where public debt could be dangerous, because if it picks up to a point where you can't repay it as a government, you may default. And if you cannot pay and you default, the outstanding loan cannot be repaid back, and no one's going to give you any money to finance yourself. Credit agencies like Moody's and Fitch and Standard & Poor assess each country's ability to pay back their debts.
And that's how you rate it.
Exactly.
A and B.
And the ratings are complex. I don't claim to understand them. When I look at the tables, it's fantastic why it's capital A and plus here and minus. Because we're used to in academia A plus, A and whatnot. But their systems are based on government's ability to pay back outstanding debt. When they say 80% of your GDP is debt. So let's say your GDP is 100 riyals and your outstanding debt is 80 riyals. So your economy produces, this has nothing to do directly with government finances at the moment, it's just a measure.
Yeah.
Is it really bad? Are you able to pay? So what we're saying is, if you didn't do anything with that output and only repaid back your loans as a country, you'll be left with 20 riyals. And that's not how it works. The government will be paying back from that 80 riyals, maybe every year 5 riyals. But where does it come from? From the sale of oil or gas, from the fees or the taxes that it pays. So technically, the debt, not only is the government responsible for, we are responsible for that debt.
Yes.
So you hear in the US, for example, the debt is in trillions of dollars. Who's going to pay back that debt? If the government prints more money, that's going to cause a catastrophe, because more money, it's like adding more water to the tub. It's going to overflow. That's going to create more inflation and all sorts of problems. The taxpayers have to pay it. So at some point in time, certain countries will say, we're going to charge more tax to pay down our debt. This is what happened in the UK the last few years. Now, where do countries position themselves from this debt? Is A, control the deficit if you can. So cut back the unnecessary, and I'll use this word loosely, unnecessary spending, because what's necessary for one country might be unnecessary for another.
Yes.
What's necessary today might not be necessary tomorrow or yesterday. The other part is try and find ways to borrow sustainably. So for example, we have a debt management unit that's responsible for what type of debt do we take, how long? Should we go to banks or should we offer the international markets? Two different tools. Do we need emergency? Do we have reserves? Should we draw all of them down today or gradually use our strategic funds for a smaller part? So Oman has been managing this carefully for the last few years and is adding more tools to better management. So we borrow 15% maximum locally, along with drawdown on our reserves. And this is all in the budget to say, for example, 400 million from Oman Investment Fund, which is responsible for providing for short-term and long-term financial liquidity for Oman. The rest, where we're going to get it from? If we need to, we go to international markets. But they're looking at our ratings, which alhamdulillah improved after falling sharply, where our ability today, primarily because of oil prices and better management of our expenditures, alhamdulillah has improved to stable and sometimes a little bit positive. Meaning if we go to international markets, there's a premium that we usually get charged as a small country like Oman with highly volatile revenues to say, listen, if you're going to borrow normally under 6%, we're going to charge you 7 or 8%. طيب ليش more? Because you may default. Investors compensate themselves. And this applies to any type of rate, whether it's ribh, under Islamic sort of Sharia compliant tools or not. These risks are included because lending money is a risky business.
Yes.
But the better ratings you get, this premium becomes small. Doesn't mean we can borrow on the cheap. So public finances becomes critical because it means all of our plans, our visions, all of the things that we depend on government either to drive the process or provide basic services to make sure that those services reach the standard we want may not be possible if we drive a ridiculously high debt. What is the cutoff? Some say 60% of your output, some say more or less. Primarily, it's on your ability to pay back.
And I hope, inshallah, one day we'll be able to pay back our debt.
Alhamdulillah, we've done
Inshallah.
great stuff in 2022. We've repaid back almost 3 to 4 billion riyals worth of debt from those, which meant what? It helps us reduce costs in the future. There is, as individuals, there are times where you have to borrow. Do you borrow to go on a trip? Luxury? Pleasure, leisure?
Or do you borrow for the necessities?
Necessities, education, building a home because there is equity in your house, or la qaddar Allah, you need to go for health reasons, whatever it is. Those are the choices we need to make as a government, as a society. But the more informed, the better decisions we can make.
Your Highness Dr. Adham bin Turki Al Sayyid, thank you very much for being with us on the show. There's a lot to talk about when it comes to economics, but I hope today we were able to cover the necessities about economics, and I hope it was fruitful for our viewers and listeners, and hope to see you soon, inshallah.
Inshallah. Thank you very much for having me, and I wish you all the best, inshallah.
Thank you. Dear brothers and sisters, thank you very much for watching and listening to Dome Podcast. I'm your host, Hatim Abdissalaam. See you next time, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.